Story 1. When the event I'm about to share happened, I was 20 years old, and I'm sharing it because I know I'm not the only guy who has gone through it. I also know that as a guy, these types of experiences can leave one feeling confused, embarrassed, or worse. My mother used to be a manager at a henhouse grocery store in the city where I was born and raised. When a job opening became available in the deli, she offered the position to me, so I took it. I was working with 3 other people, one of whom I became fast friends with. His name was Alvin, and he had moved to the Midwest from Louisiana. I forgot exactly what he said had happened, but the gist of it was that he had gotten into some trouble back home, and his mom asked Alvin's brother if he could come and stay with him. When I met Alvin's older brother, I was excited to find out that he worked as a sheriff's deputy in the county I lived in. I had planned to become a police officer myself once I turned 21, so having Alvin's older brother as a sort of mentor made it seem all the more possible. One night, I heard the honk of a car horn in front of my home. Peeking out the window, I recognized the car to be Alvin's brother's unmarked sheriff's vehicle. It was only 1 minute from the grocery store and 5 minutes from his house, so it didn't seem all that out of place. But I was a bit confused as to why he stopped by so late. To be honest, I was kind of hoping he would invite me for a ride along, which is where a civilian rides shotgun with an on-duty police officer to learn more about what law enforcement does. When I got to the car, he told me to hop in. I asked, "Where's Alvin?" He went to some rave out in the country somewhere, and I'm worried about him, so I want to go get him," he answered. "I just wanted to swing by and ask if you wanted to ride along and help me search for the location." "Yeah, sure," I said. I can't really remember how long we drove around, but where my mother and I lived was already on the edge of the city, so getting to the rural parts wouldn't have taken that long. However, he did drive a way out, and the darkness swallowed everything that was illuminated by the car's headlights. I had attended many rafts in my teens, so I do remember finding it odd that a raft would be held in the rural area we were in. Then, at some point, Alvin's brother said, "You know I love you, right?" Now, I was far from an innocent kid growing up, so I was immediately suspicious of this off-the-wall question. "Whatever, man." "No, you don't get it," he replied in a way that sounded frustrated. "I'm in love with you." He emphasized the words, "in love." "This isn't good," a voice screamed in my head. I sort of glanced at his service weapon on his hip out of the corner of my eye and thought, this is really bad. Then I noticed the car began to slow down, and I looked over at Alvin's brother, who was staring at me, the car now moving at a crawl. "Look," he began, "I'll take care of you. I got a lot of money, so I can buy you a car or a house, whatever you want. Just let me have you." This time, the voice in my head wouldn't stop screaming. My heart was pounding, and sweat began to slowly drip down my face. "I'm not like that, man," I tried to explain. "You know I have a girlfriend. I'm not like that." Now the car wasn't moving, and though it was inky dark around us, the light from the car's instrument panel only glowed a little, and I was able to see the scowl on his face. "Well, it seems the rave may have already shut down," he said, after what seemed like an hour of sitting in the middle of a dark rural road in awkward silence. He then pulled a U-turn and began heading back in the direction we had just come. Thank God. I finally arrived home after maybe a 45-minute drive of silence and awkwardness. As we pulled up in front of my house, I went to open the door and get out, but felt his hand grab my forearm. "If you tell anyone about this, just remember." He trailed off, as if thinking twice about what he was about to say, and then he let my arm go. I got out of his car, shut the door, and never turned to look back. I just wanted to get inside my house as fast as I could and lock the door. I never saw or heard from Alvin's brother again after that. I'm glad. Story 2. I grew up in Northern California in a quite poor rural area. Some of my best friends from elementary and middle school lived like 10 to 15 miles away. So on weekends, instead of just going over to visit for the day, we'd have sleepovers to save our parents from driving on these crazy road trips. I had this one friend called Star, whose parents were like old school hippies. Their house always smelled of patchouli, and they were vegan even before veganism was really a thing. Aside from a few unusual recreational activities, they were basically just as good at being parents as any other couple. They were sweet, loving, and attentive, and I always had a ball whenever I went to sleep over at their place, mainly because they let us stay outdoors and tent at night, which was just a huge adventure for a little group of preteen boys. Anyway, this one night we are staying in a tent in the backyard. The backyard extended to one side of the house where we camped and was in view of the TV room window, so Star's mom and dad could keep an eye on us. But it also meant we could see the driveway from the flap of our tent. It was summertime, so it was still incredibly warm at night. We ended up leaving the tent flap unzipped to let some cool air in. It obviously wasn't open all the way because of the bugs, but we could still see outside the tent. Then, in the middle of the night, Star shakes me awake and whispers, "There's someone in the driveway." I thought it might have been her big brother, who was a few years older than us and attending college, but when I suggested that, she said, "No, it's a bunch of people. Look." I started getting really anxious hearing that, so I quietly crept up to the tent flap to peek out. That's when I saw that Star was exactly right. In the little bit of moonlight that we had, I literally lost count of the number of people I saw creeping up the driveway. It was seriously one of the scariest moments of my life, mainly because there was absolutely nothing to do but keep as quiet as possible. We couldn't call the cops. This was way before cell phones. We couldn't warn Star's parents without revealing our presence. We were just powerless, forced to watch people who obviously didn't have good intentions slowly approaching Star's house. I think, in the end, Star just broke. In a move you could either call real brave or real stupid, she just ran out of the tent, shouting, "Get away from my house! Mom, Dad, call the cops!" As soon as she started screaming, a bunch of flashlights burst to life, obviously held by the guys sneaking up the driveway. Oh my God, there were so many of them. At first glance in the darkness, it looked like no more than about 5 or 6 people, But when they all turned their flashlights on, it was clear the number was more like 15 or 20. I just heard the sheriff say, "Show me your hands." It was incredibly confusing because we were all about calling the cops to get help, but the cops were already here. Anyway, Star did as she was told, and so did me and my other friends. We started climbing out of our tent with our hands in the air. That was when the person approaching us started saying, "Jesus, they're just kids, man." And with them being closer, I could see that they really were cops, with caps, badges, and all the patches on their arms and all that stuff. I heard them say, "Go, go, go, get in there." And the cops started bashing the front door to the house. Other cops gathered around the backyard and headed towards one of the barns. We were scared, obviously, but more focused on just staying down and watching. We weren't really freaking out too bad, but when the cops started dragging Star's mom and dad out of the house and arresting them, she had to be restrained by the cop that was guarding us. After that, the cops drove me and her friends back to our respective homes. Then, I don't know what they did with Star. I think they took her to her grandma's or aunt's or whatever. But then, a few days later, we found out that Star's mom and dad had been growing something they shouldn't have in one of their barns. I get that it was illegal and stuff, but the aftermath was just so sad. Star had to go live with her relatives because her parents were sent off to prison for a few years. It was messed up, and I get that the cops were just doing their job and stuff, but it was definitely one of the scariest times of my life, seeing all those figures in black just creeping towards my friend's house. Story 3. This was a few years ago. It was pretty late, past 1:30, around 2 a.m. I was living with this boy who was pretty abusive, and he'd gotten really jealous at this party we were at earlier that night. Not even an hour after we got home, he tossed me out onto our front porch and then locked the door behind me. I was knocking and pleading for him to please let me back inside, still wearing what I had worn to the party earlier, and it was freezing out. I wasn't sure what to do. He had my phone, purse, and wallet inside the house with him, so I just sat on the porch crying. When he turned the light off, both inside and outside of the house, I knew he wasn't going to let me back in. I felt so cold and so helpless. I thought about knocking on the neighbor's door, though we didn't really have many, but I had anxiety about walking up to any of them and causing trouble for my boyfriend. So instead, I decided I would try to walk to the gas station and motel, which was a little less than a mile away, so I could use their phone and call a girlfriend of mine to see if I could sleep over with her. Ironically enough, the road I was walking on was Donner Pass Road, so the freezing cold was fitting. But anyway, a little bit into the walk, this tall white pickup truck was approaching on the opposite side of the road. I tried not to make eye contact for obvious reasons, but then I heard the truck stopping and beginning to make a U-turn. My heart just started pounding, and I just about froze up, forcing myself to speed walk at the very least. The truck pulled up next to me. The guy rolled down his window and asked what I was doing out this late. I told him how I was going to see my friend at the gas station and that she was expecting me. He sort of smiled and then offered me a ride. I said, no thank you, citing that I shouldn't hitchhike, He told me, "Well, good. I don't pick up hitchhikers or anyone. You don't look like a hitchhiker, though. You just look like you need some help." He kept driving next to me, telling me I shouldn't think he's a creep. And then he pulled out what looked like a police badge and told me he'd just gotten off duty, which is why he was in civilian clothes and out so late. He said he wouldn't mind driving next to me just to make sure I got to where I was heading safely. I was naive and a bit too trusting of his kindness and credentials, and when he offered me a ride again, I said that it would be nice because the gas station wasn't that far away anyway. He popped the door open for me, and I hopped in. The radio was low, and it was a little messy. The ashtray was full of cigarettes, and there were a lot of newspapers on the passenger floor. As I was moving my feet, some of the papers shifted, showing a pair of handcuffs, coffee cups, empty water bottles, rags, a highlight-colored bandana, and some other random items. He apologized, saying it was the truck he took hunting. It was super warm, so I was happy and didn't mind at all. He told me his name was John and asked why I was scantily dressed without a jacket. I started to tell him about the party and the fight I'd had with my boyfriend. He was super charming and attentive. He even laughed that he could go back and arrest my boyfriend. I asked him about himself, and he told me about his family. He was a young dad, had a wife, a daughter, a son, and a dog. I told him it was like he had a perfect little family. He laughed and said he certainly did. I then asked if I could use his phone, but he said no because he had to save his battery. We were approaching the gas station, and he drove right past it. I politely said, "Oh, I think that's the one," but he didn't answer me. I felt sick to my stomach, and my heart started pounding. I began getting choked up, and my eyes started tearing up as I was looking out the window, watching the lights get further and further away. It was hard for me to even speak, but somehow I murmured, asking if he could please turn around. He ignored me. Whenever I would look at him, he just looked empty, emotionless, totally dead, and glazed over. I looked back out the window and down the road to see if maybe we were going slow enough that I could make a leap out of the car without seriously injuring myself. I remembered always hearing, "Never go to the second location." I thought about the possibility of jumping out and breaking an ankle and how it would be harder to get away with one foot as opposed to two. I was debating with myself because there was snow on the ground, and snow is hard to get along in, especially when you're not fully clothed. I feel so dumb now too, because I wasn't even tied up or anything. I was just so scared. All there was were trees, an empty road, and us. I was crying pretty badly at this point and asked if I could borrow his phone again. I don't even know why I asked. He then told me to stop talking. He started talking under his breath, saying things like, "Girls shouldn't be out so late. You shouldn't have been alone this late, of course. You're doing this to me, dressed like that," and other derogatory things. He kept saying these terrible things, way too many to type out here. I wasn't even responding, just crying and trying to think past the fear I was feeling. I remembered the pair of handcuffs, the ones underneath those papers under my feet. I managed to use my feet as a scoop to push them as far beneath the seat as I could. I was thinking of different things I could do to help myself, Like if we were close enough to some upcoming lights or structures, I could grab the wheel and cause us to crash into them. Or maybe if I got lucky enough for a cop to pass us, I could grab the wheel and swerve so it would appear that it was a drunk driver and we'd get pulled over. I guiltily thought about the possibility that this man was just having a weird night and how if I did anything, it would hurt him. But I told myself that sort of thinking got me into this mess. He pulled off the road where there were still woods on both sides of us. On his side, the wooded trees were closer to the road, and on mine, there was a small gap, fully covered and thick with snow, before the trees picked up maybe 10 to 16 yards away. He turned the car off and coldly said, "There's something wrong with the car. Get out with me." As he grabbed the keys and was stepping out of the car, I grabbed onto the center console, crying and pleading for him not to make me get out with him because it was too cold. He turned around to face me, his door still open, and shouted at me to get out of the car because we had to go check out the truck bed hatch. I dug my fingernails deeper into the console, thinking that my cries of no and head shaking would cause him to come around to my side of the car and drag me out himself. I was crying and said, "Please, John, I'm so cold and scared," thinking of everything you're told to do in these types of situations. Humanize yourself. Use their first name. He stared at me in this way I can't even begin to describe to this day. He got back into the car and I slinked toward my window, scared he would drag me over the console. He turned off the headlights and everything just looked dark blue. He stared at the steering wheel for what felt like years before lighting up a cigarette and looking out his window, then back at me, and then back out his window. He heard me shuffle my feet on the newspapers. I was just adjusting my legs, but while still staring out his window, he told me that if I thought about running, he had a quick way to get me where he wanted me. Oddly enough, I was sort of thinking about running minutes before that. The reason that if he wanted me to get out of the car, then I should definitely stay in. Otherwise, he could chase me or shoot me. I'm glad I was right. At this point, I sort of hit the bottom of my reserve. Instead of panic, there was numbness, exhaustion. There was still a hot tear or two that would trickle down. But I just remember being numb. It was dead quiet, but I finally barely audibly told him that my friend was still waiting for me. I asked about his wife and children. He flatly said he didn't have a wife or children, and that his house was empty. I asked him what he was thinking about, and he said, "I'm thinking about what to do with you." He didn't say it angrily. He just said it flatly and coldly, which scared me even more. I started getting worked up back into a cry, and at that point, he told me not to cry and turned the car on, offering me some heat. I again just told him I wanted to go home. Eventually, he started driving and kept driving until we were approaching a gas station. I was gauging the right time to reach for the wheel, but before I could, he started slowing down while pulling up. He told me not to tell anyone, or he would find me. He told me not to tell anyone, or he would find me. Then he told me all he was doing was teaching me a lesson not to hitchhike with strangers. He was almost to a complete stop when he told me to get out before he changed his mind. Before he could even get another look at me to assess my understanding, I was already out of the truck, sprinting toward the gas station. The panic was so overwhelming, but then I stopped and remembered to try to see his license plate. I turned around, but only caught the blur of the last 3 numbers as he was driving off. I ran inside and asked the clerk behind the counter to please call the police, and I waited until the officer got there. I'll be honest, I was a little scared that the officer might be John. My fears melted away when a new-faced policeman arrived. I gave him the description of John, his appearance, the vehicle color and type, the parts of the license plate number I caught, and the fact that he claimed to be an off-duty cop. Just basically anything I could. I asked him if he could look at the cameras, and the officer disappeared into the back for a little bit. He then came back out saying there was nothing on them. I asked if I could look, and the officer said no, and asked if I didn't trust him. I told him, of course I do. The officer then gave me a ride back to my friend's house, lecturing me the entire time for hitchhiking and asking if I knew who Ted Bundy was. I never heard anything back after the report was made, so I would try to follow up. Each time I did, they never got back to me, aside from this one time when I was told my case number didn't even exist. But that didn't stop me from trying to follow up throughout the months and years. I asked my friend if she ever heard of any weirdness or anything since that incident, and she said no. So I sort of let it go and tried to tell myself that maybe he was actually just trying to teach me a lesson or something. I mean, I definitely never hitchhiked again. So if it was a lesson, it certainly worked. Still, I haven't heard anything back regarding the case, and I never heard about any other odd experiences up there. Maybe it was just one random man trying to teach me something. Honestly, I think I'm just trying to tell myself that so I can sleep better at night. Regardless, I'm really glad I didn't get out of the car and into the woods that night. This might not be your typical creepy encounter, and please delete if it's not allowed here, but this has kept me up for a few nights now.